everyone, and welcome back to the Courage Conversation Show. I'm your host, Ashley Easter. I'm the founder and executive director of Courage 365, and we have an amazing show planned for you tonight. So I'm interviewing a colleague of mine. Her name is Guila Benchimol, and you know I'm dyslexic, guys, so let me say that once more. Guila Benchimol. She is an amazing woman. She is actually on the SNAP board, along with being on another nonprofit that she works on, and I have just been loving the work she's doing for survivors, and I am super excited to have her on the show. We tried to get her on last season. It didn't work, so guys, this has been a long time in coming. Super excited. So let me just read a quick bio before we invite Guila onto the show. So Dr. Guila Benchimol is a senior advisor on research and learning with the SRE network. Guila serves as principal researcher for the Center of Communal Research at the Orthodox Union. As a researcher and public educator on sexual violence, she has crafted policies for Jewish institutions and has been invited to address Jewish professionals and clergy across Canada and the United States, as well as other faith communities. She sits on the SNAP board, which is short for Survivors Network of Those Abused by Priests, where I'm also a member of that board. Guila holds a PhD in criminology and has an MA in criminology and criminal justice policy from the University of Guelph, Ontario, Canada. So Guila has quite a bio. She has so much expertise, and I cannot wait to invite her onto the show. So without further ado, Guila, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me, Ashley. I'm so happy that this worked out. And thank you for being my colleague on the SNAP board and for everything that you do for survivors.
That warms my heart. I'm so glad when we get to have conversations like this, because so many times it's just work. And now we get to have an in-depth conversation. So you are doing work for abuse survivors within the Jewish Orthodox community. And that is such a beautiful and important role that you serve, because as we know here at Courage 365, abuse impacts every single community. And while many of our survivors have come from more of a Christian background, and they may not be Christian identifying anymore, we have some atheists and agnostics and people who, have left Christianity, but a lot of our survivors, that has been their basis. And so I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your work, and then maybe just introduce us to some of the concepts within the Jewish Orthodox community, like what some of the denominations look like, because honestly, to some of us, we may be really uneducated about this. And I know for myself, I'm excited to learn, because I think we have a lot more in common than we have apart.
Yes, I agree with you 100%. And it's one of the joys of being part of the SNAP board is meeting survivors and leaders from different faith communities and really seeing how we have so many similarities. So I'm just going to talk about my work briefly. I am an Orthodox Jewish woman, so I come from the Orthodox community, but my work spans around survivorship and victimization in all Jewish spaces. So that means across different Jewish denominations, which I'll talk about in a minute. However, my academic work has both been on religious communities and religious survivors, as well as those in the mainstream population. And it's really been interesting to be able to see the differences and similarities amongst different kinds of survivors coming from different places, different cultural backgrounds, ethnic backgrounds, religious backgrounds, etc. Part of the SRE network, what I do there is I'm the senior advisor on research and learning. So I do research for them. I do public education like this talk and others. Before COVID, there was a lot of traveling involved, and it's really an honor to be able to train rabbis, board members, all kinds of folks, professionals around the issues of discrimination and harassment and sexual victimization in Jewish spaces. And my work at the Orthodox Union is to be a principal researcher on issues affecting the Orthodox community. In terms of the different denominations, so what I'm going to say now is just a blip, and anybody is welcome to educate themselves. There's a lot of material online or to reach out to me, and I'm happy to have further conversations. But there are different denominations in the Jewish faith, including Orthodox, where I come from, conservative, Reform, Reconstructionist, and more. And even amongst those different denominations, there's a wide spectrum of how different people in those denominations practice Judaism. And even, some of the things that they do or do not do, believe in, or, do not hold by. In addition to the denominations, like any other group, Jews come from across the globe, and we bring with us different customs from the cultures from where we come from. So, for example, my family comes from Morocco. And so my customs are really different than a lot of my friends' customs. And we are Spanish speaking Moroccans. So we're different than the French speaking Moroccans. So that's just like a little bit. What I would say is when I entered the field of this work, I really thought that silence was, reigned supreme only in the Orthodox Jewish community. And that when I would go to other denominations, it wouldn't be silent, right? That they would really be more open to talking about abuse and being supportive of survivors. And I'd say what I found was that I was a little bit naive. Silence exists everywhere. It just looks different. And so, you have to get at the core of what is difficult for this particular group to acknowledge and to address. And, hopefully we could come up with some tools to help them do that.
That is such helpful information. And as you're talking, I'm like, oh my gosh, there's so many similarities between the Jewish religion and the Christian religion in that we also have so many denominations. But even within a denomination, like for instance, Baptist, you can say you're Baptist, but there might be like 20 different kinds of Baptist, and then within each of those mini Baptist denominations within the larger, Baptist structure, each person's going to have a different thought. And so it is such, I think religious communities are so diverse, and I think it's important to understand that, because I think a lot of times when we come from one religion, we tend to see the nuances and the different beliefs. But when we look at another religion, because we're not familiar with it, we just kind of think of it as like a monolith and like it's all the same. And so I love how you brought out like the different pieces and different, just everybody thinks a little bit differently. There's so many bits from different places across the world. And also what really resonated with me was when I grew up, I was very conservative Christian, extremely conservative Christian. And so I thought that was the only place abuse was. And then when I got into a more progressive Christian space, I was like, oh yeah, they handle this much better. And well, maybe they have the language, like there's still the abuse and cover-ups that are happening. They just, it's almost more disappointing when they know better, but they're still doing wrong. And so that makes a lot of sense what you're saying. And I can see a lot of like interplay and yeah,
that's 100% true. And I would say one of the big differences among the denominations is how gender equity looks. And, following some of your work, I have seen that as well. And so, that also adds a layer to the ability to address different kinds of victims of different genders, and even perpetrators of different genders, and how that looks in the different denominations. So it's a really true point that you're saying.
That makes sense. So maybe you could talk to us a little bit about some of the issues surrounding abuse in Jewish spaces and, maybe what you've discovered that works to combat abuse. Because again, many of the people watching may have only looked at abuse from one religious lens. And I think we can learn across, different denominations and across different religions, strategies and tools, and I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on all of that.
Sure. So I'm going to try not to mire us in the negative. However, we do have to acknowledge that there are, issues around abuse happening, as well as addressing it in Jewish spaces. So the term Jewish spaces carries a lot of weight, right? It has a lot of meaning. What is a Jewish space really? So it could mean an organization, it could mean an institution, it could mean a community, it could mean a family, but there is no one Jewish space, right? There are many Jewish communities and many Jewish spaces. In addition to that, we have Jewish texts where sometimes abuse is talked about or hinted to, alluded to, right? And how do we deal with Jewish texts that talk about that? How do we address them? How do we learn about power and how not to treat people from those kinds of texts? So as I was saying before, abuse is not a Jewish problem or even a religious problem. It is a human problem. So that's one thing that I want to state. However, sometimes religion, and today I'm going to talk about Judaism specifically, can be used to harm victims, to harm survivors, to empower perpetrators, to let people off the hook, or it can be used to actually bolster the people that we need to be supporting. So some of the issues that I have found are very similar to those in other communities. These include a lack of education around safety, around our bodies, around sexual education for youth, around healthy relationships. Although I have seen that changing over time, where in some Jewish spaces they have crafted programs to teach kids, right? They'll come into the schools and they'll teach the kids, from different ages at an age appropriate level. And I was really encouraged to see this happening, right? And with leadership support, that we're going to have an all day learning and we're going to come in, we're going to teach this to the kids. In addition, silence is a really big issue. So not talking about abuse when it happens, ignoring and looking away from the stories, looking away from the victims that come forward and survivors that say, this happened to me. The cognitive dissonance that happens. So that is like the overload when we hear that somebody we love, the person we sit next to in synagogue, our neighbor, our uncle, whoever it may be, has caused harm. And we know this person and we're like, it can't be. And they're a religious person. They would never do such a thing, right? So this cognitive dissonance that we have where we don't want to accept that. And so therefore we hold on really tightly to our belief that it is impossible that this person did anything wrong, even when faced with large amounts of evidence that they actually did. And what that does is we leave the survivor in the cold. And I'll say that survivors from the Jewish community have said to me, when I came forward and nobody supported me, I didn't just lose my ability to function in the community or go to the synagogue, but my religious community was a family. And so I lost my family. So what I think there's a lack of understanding of the long-term effects of victimization on those who have experienced it, and then B, what it means when your community, your faith group does not stand by you when you come forward. In addition, there's the re-victimization that happens. So just the lack of knowledge of how to respond when somebody comes forward and says this happens. And I don't always think it's coming from a bad place, although sometimes it does. I sometimes think people just don't know how to respond. And so they say the wrong things, but let's educate people around how to have the empathy. What are the right things to say? What are the wrong things to say? There's lack of cooperation or even knowledge about the relevant laws, right? So reporting, how to deal with the criminal justice system. I also think sometimes the criminal justice system prioritizes the views of religious leaders versus the experiences of those coming forward about them. And that's been something that we have seen in real high profile child abuse cases in religious communities. In addition, there is the burden and the tentacles of abuse, of how far reaching they are, not just to the survivor, but oftentimes to their family and friends. And so I sometimes wish leaders, right, religious leaders would understand they have the ability to impact. It's not just one person. Even if it was one person, it should be enough, but it's actually so much wider than that. And they have so much power in the moment of how they respond, right? Are they going to encourage the perpetrator to do the right thing? Are they going to support the survivor? Are they going to do everything they can to rally the community around the survivor, right? To actually practice the religious values that they preach, as opposed to just say, we want to treat everyone right and we want to be moral, upstanding individuals. Gender is definitely an issue that I see in religious communities, where the focus has often been on, in some Jewish spaces, on boys and not necessarily on women. That would be in more of the Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox spaces. Although, again, that has changed, especially with the Me Too movement, where I think women's victimization had been more visible in religious spaces than it was before. There are so many. So let's talk about how it could actually be improved. What can we do to improve some of these things? Because I think that was the second part of your question, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So one of the ways is this conversation, right? Is let's have a conversation about it. Let's actually talk about those difficulties. Let's talk about the issues. Let's brainstorm about the solutions. Let's educate ourselves and educate others. There is the implementation of policies, both around prevention around intervention and around investigations, right? So having the policies in place before something comes up, before something arises, as opposed to deer in the headlights, something is happening, let's figure out what we need to do. Because in those moments, those in charge are not able to think clearly. And often when they are thinking, it's about reputation management. If you're thinking about reputation management, you're not going to be prioritizing the survivor and their needs. There's research. A lot of religious communities don't gather the data on abuse in their communities because they don't want to show what has gone wrong. But therefore, we won't know the extent of the problem and the things that we need to do right. I think media coverage and social media, where survivors themselves have been amplifying their own stories and those of others, as well as their own advocacy and activism, has been a huge not solution, but has drawn a lot of attention to this issue. However, I sometimes wonder, is it the media's job to do it? Like, why aren't religious communities doing it on their own? And sometimes they've been pushed to do it because their name is in the news, and using Jewish values in text to actually respond in a more appropriate way, right? We have texts that tell us do not stand idly by, right? We have texts that tell us how to care for one another. Well, let's employ those texts to actually respond well, and just making it an important issue, an all the time issue, not just when it's like a timely news story, right? So those are just some. There's like obviously a lot more solutions, but even if we just like come out of this conversation saying, that's the one I want to hone in on in my Jewish space or in my religious space because there's so many similarities, like that would be a win, you know?
Yes, yes, yes. I love that so much. And one thing that just kind of struck me, what you said, was about, survivors telling their stories, especially on social media, and then also reporters and journalists covering abuse stories, and how, while they're doing that, we really thank them for their work. Like, it shouldn't be up to the survivors and it shouldn't be up to the media. The actual communities where the abuse is happening should be self-policing, and they should be looking at the data, and they should be getting the education and taking people out of leadership whose intentions are not for survivors. And I think religious texts, whether it is whoever's religious text they're using, it can be used as a manipulation tool, or it can be used as something that is an encouragement and spurs people towards justice, and really latching on to those pieces of our values and morals from whatever community we're in, and leveraging those to help survivors and to kind of put a fire underneath of us. And I wish that we would see that happening more with faith leaders. And, there are some, but, in the meantime, while we're building up steam, it is amazing what survivors are doing, speaking out publicly, and so thankful for the journalists who are stepping up to the plate in the absence of communities like really
doing what they should be doing 100%. Yeah. And at the beginning of this talk, you mentioned that your listeners, some of them have remained in religious communities and some of them are no longer in religious communities. And one of the things that I found so moving with the survivors that I interviewed for my dissertation on how is it that survivors become activists and advocates, like how is it that you've suffered so much and then you find the wherewithal somewhere to say, I'm going to make a difference in the world on this thing that harmed me so badly. One of the things that I was so moved when I interviewed people who were abused in religious spaces was whether they remained in the faith group or they left the faith group, they said, I'm not criticizing because I want to take down that faith group. I'm criticizing because I'm advocating or being an activist because I care about the people in that faith group. And I want to force the faith group to live up to what they claim to believe in. And so even if I've left, I don't want that church or that mosque or that synagogue to be an unsafe place. And so I'm still going to fight for survivors, even if I no longer believe in the same religion as they do. And to me, that was just so moving that, thank you to every survivor who is doing the work to make it a safer place for everyone else.
Yes, and it just shows, I guess, the compassion of the human soul and the well-meaningness and vital advocacy work of people, no matter where they are. whether they're pursuing a faith journey or not, just that care for other people. And I think that's something that we can all unite around, no matter how we identify, religious or not. And thank you for bringing that forward, because I think that's really important data. And I know growing up for me, I was often told in a very conservative religious group, conservative Christian religious group, that anybody who wasn't Christian like us, didn't have a motivation to care for other people.
Right.
And that was the only reason that was good in the world, was because of our specific religion. And when you step back and you look at the actual data, and the people who are part of different religious groups or not part of a religion at all, or maybe they're spiritual but not religious, and they still have this human desire to care for others and stand up for what is right, I really think that's something that we can all unify around. And
Yes.
I don't know, it doesn't seem like it's talked about enough, but I love that concept.
Well, that's part of why I studied that very question, because it was like there was this whole narrative that it's so normal for somebody who survives abuse to become an advocate and an activist, but actually it's really, really difficult. I mean, they have to come forward, they disclose. Oftentimes there's secondary victimization where they're not treated well when they disclose, and sometimes, in the words of the survivors I interviewed, they go back in the closet of silence, right, where they're no longer talking about that, and then they decide, no, not only am I going to talk about it, but I'm going to be an advocate for other victims. And so I was like, just the ability to do that, to improve the world for others, even though you have been hurt so much. And some people said to me, this has been the only thing that heals me. Advocacy is the only thing that heals me. And others said it actually hurts me, because I have to relive it every time I speak to a victim or every time I give a public talk, but I don't care. I'm going to do it because I know that it's making the world better. And so to me, it's so inspiring.
Wow. Huh. So amazing. And also just interesting how different people process things. And I think in my own advocacy journey, I've had both sides of that. I've had the side where I was like, I can't not do this because I have to help other people, because I feel responsibility and I know it's healing myself. And then I've also hit points where I'm like, whoa, this is really harming me, because I'm always getting, hit with these waves
Yeah.
and these, um, spears, and have had to kind of like relearn how to put boundaries in my life and how to find safety. But still, there's always this thing of like, I can't not speak, because
Yes.
if I could help somebody else, how could I not do that? And I realize for some people listening, that's not the place that they're in right now, and there's no judgment there, but just talking about some common experiences that many survivors feel. I would really like to kind of talk about some things that you've written about. So you've done like some articles in the Huffington Post and other places, and this question is really kind of drawing on some of the work that you've done and some of your writing. So, we often hear people ask in response to a disclosure or evidence of abuse, things like, why didn't they tell somebody sooner? Why are they just speaking up now? Why is it just coming to light now? Or, why didn't they tell anybody then? Why is this the timing they're deciding to speak up? Is this like just for an attention thing? Is it because it's popular and trendy? Maybe you can just kind of address, you've already mentioned this a little bit, but like the silencing of victims and survivors. And you mentioned that in your Huffington Post article. And one of the lines in there that I thought was particularly potent was, you must understand what role we play in building the silence around them. And that is so powerful, because it's not just on the survivor. There's a whole system around them. And can you explain what that means, and maybe, what we can do to change this?
Sure. So I would say that I'm obsessed with silence and how it
Mm.
manifests in our life. And I'm obsessed with speech that silences when we think we're actually talking, but that speech is being used to silence. I credit, two professors that led me down the path of looking at some writings on silence. Shaul Kellner and Mervyn Horgan. I'll send this to them after and say thank you to them. But when I started looking at silence, and then I started linking it to power and violence, I saw how it intersects with abuse. And so, exactly what you said, there is a machine of silence that we, all of us, have a place in. And we have to stop and say, what is my role here? What role have I played vis-a-vis silence, speech, and power when it comes to abuse, when it comes to victimization, and when it comes to disclosure? So silence is actually the thing that allows crime to happen, right? It's either shrouded in silence and secrecy, or it happens under the cover of night, or where nobody knows about it, right? Like, abusers aren't usually just abusing people in public. It happens in silence. And then they can, coerce, they can threaten, due to fear, due to anything, the victim into silence, right? And so sometimes silence happens and victims are silenced because nobody else knows that this happened. But oftentimes victims are silent because they know or believe that they will not be heard when they come forward, or that if they are heard, they will not be given the credibility. And so this can happen with, for example, criminal justice system. A person goes to report to the criminal justice system, and the control agents in that system, the lawyers, the judges, the police officers, don't take them seriously, or they disparage them, right? And they say, well, what were you wearing? Or we can't bring this case forward because you're not going to be believed, and things of that nature. It can also happen, silence can happen by professionals who say, I'm a mental health professional. I know better than you about your experiences. Let me tell you, this is not a symptom of abuse. This is a mental health issue. Well, sometimes there are both, but oftentimes, right, the things that we see, the behaviors that we see manifest are evidence of the victimization that occurred. And in not giving credence to that, and in not telling a survivor, I see that you are having these difficult experiences because of what happened to you, we're negating what happened to them and only focusing on the after effect, right? And so we're only allowing them to live half their story. In addition, bystander silence, right? When we know, or we think we know, that something is happening and we don't raise the flag, or we don't even just approach the victim and say, hey, like, are you okay? Or we don't approach the perpetrator, who is our friend, and say, I'm watching this and, like, something is going on here. You're in a relationship that I don't think is safe. Like, as your friend, I need to speak up, or how can I support you to stop doing these kinds of behaviors? Religious leaders have a huge influence. And do they choose to speak about these issues from the pulpit, as part of their sermons, if they're giving sermons in their community? Do people believe that their leader is someone who is silent around abuse? Or do they feel, in my faith community, I have a religious leader that I can go to, and I know that they will listen to me, and they will believe me, and they will hear me. So these are some of the ways that the machine of silence happens. And so when we look at all of these other roles, and how we can play with silence, no wonder why victims are quiet. No wonder why survivors don't want to come forward. No wonder why we oftentimes don't report. I will say, however, and this was a really interesting finding in my study, was when victims and survivors that I interviewed, we were talking about when they came forward and why they didn't come forward and all of that. They said, so many people said, I was so afraid of coming forward because I believed I wouldn't be heard. I believed I wouldn't be believed. I believed this and that. But oh my goodness, when I came forward and I was believed, and I found community, and I built community around me, I didn't know that that was going to happen. If only I had done it sooner. Now, that is not to say that there isn't a risk in coming forward. I don't want to minimize that risk to anybody. But I also want to say, for those that came forward and found community, they wanted people to know that it's not always a negative response. And you need to ignore sometimes those people if you have the wherewithal to do that, and find the people that are your allies, that will sit with you in your pain, and sit with you in your joy, and sit with you in, if you choose to, your decisions that you choose to do after you come forward with your disclosure. Does that answer the question?
Yes, absolutely. And you're right, there are so many different parts to the silencing. And I think so many times people just throw it all back on the survivors. Again, the victim blaming, but it's like, why are they not speaking? Well, it's not just because of themselves. It's because of the system that's been created around them that doesn't make them feel safe. And maybe we should be pointing fingers at that system around them versus the survivor feeling unsafe in that system. And I have also seen just a beautiful change, even in the last, 6 years or so, of just the acceptance of survivors within survivor communities, because those are growing and expanding. Like, even with Courage 365, we've got a Facebook group with several hundred members. And I know we aren't the only group that has safe communities for survivors. And that really wasn't a thing that I'm aware of, in the broad sense until the last 5 or so years. And so I think sometimes people are shocked by the support that they can receive, and sort of all about making sure that you're seeking support in the right places, because there are some people that just never will be supportive, and it's maybe not a safe person to disclose to. But yeah, I've seen a lot of survivors who had been like, wow, I didn't know I would have tons of people rally around me that I don't even know. And isn't that such a wonderful thing that in the age of information, with all this information on the internet, there is a focused effort on creating support groups for survivors. Wow.
Yeah, and I mean, that's like part of the beauty of being a colleague with you at SNAP is that, right? That leaders and survivors come together to say, you know what, we're going to build our own space for ourselves, and we're going to do what we can to support each other. And I've been following you and watching Courage 365 grow, and it's just it's a privilege to be speaking with you today. And just I'm grateful for all the work that you do for survivors.
Oh, thank you. Well, the feeling is definitely mutual, because I'm so thankful for what you're doing. And yeah, I think we each have our spot, and we just impact the survivors that are in our space, and eventually we'll impact all of them.
Yeah, I hope so.
So that's the reality.
I hope so. I mean, and in terms of the silence, in terms of like solutions to the silence, right?
Yeah.
I've had these funny moments where I've been called upon, hired to come and train an organization or whatever, and they'll be like, we want you to come and do this talk, but like, it doesn't really happen here, but we're just going to tick off the box that we did the talk, we did the training. And I'll say, you don't know what you don't know, right? The only reason why we know what we do know today is because of the bravery of the voices that have chosen to come forward. And so it's, using clear language, it's acknowledging that we don't know what we don't know. It's listening to those who come forward and really sitting with their I don't like to say story, because it's more than just a story, but sitting with their experiences, and like acknowledging that these things happen in my faith community. And what can I do to combat that? What is the role that I can play? And everybody has a different role. It doesn't mean you have to go and become a speaker or go get your doctorate, or I don't recommend it, to do any of those things. But what is your role as a member of your whatever community you may be a part of?
Yes. I love that so much. And, one question before we go, we talked about this a bit at the beginning. I just think it's so important. So, what are your top suggestions for uniting survivors from different communities, particularly faith communities, for the cause of justice? Because I think you and I, even though we come from different faith communities, we still have that same passion. And I would love to see those connective collaborations among advocates, but survivors too, because we really are more alike than we are different. And I would be really interested in your thoughts on collaboration and creating unity around justice issues like this.
Sure. So first of all, like, this conversation is an example of that. So you're already a model of that by inviting me, a Jewish Orthodox woman, to come and speak. You're giving me a platform in order to educate your listeners about Orthodox Judaism, about abuse in Jewish spaces, and to see that this is a person who embodies those communities and also does this work. So you're already doing it. But I definitely think that there are strength in numbers, and that we are more similar than we are different. And that if my community can learn from your community, then they could say, hey, they're doing that, we can as well. And hopefully it's vice versa. I wrote an op-ed with a Muslim colleague of mine, for example, about how both Muslim and Jewish communities needed to support their survivors at a certain time where this issue was very much in the public eye. And we published the op-ed in both a Muslim journalistic outlet as well as a Jewish journalistic outlet. And we got permission from both outlets to print the same piece in two different outlets that one might think would not have anything to do with one another, but we wanted to say the same words together to our communities. So there are definitely things that we can say, okay, let's come together. Harvard put together this Faith and Flourishing conference around combating child abuse, and they had representation from all different religious groups, which I thought was wonderful. So different people can see themselves there. So it's about coming together, saying, what can I learn from you? what can you learn from me? How can I help your community? How can you help my community? And also, it really takes away that feeling of isolation. When I speak to a victim from another religious group or a survivor from another religious group, and I say, wow, that happened in my community too, or that happened to me too, I feel less alone. I feel I have a partner in doing this work, and I feel like, okay, we're going to do this. We're going to make a difference, right? So it's about coming up with creative solutions, writing, talking, doing events, all these kinds of things together.
Mm, yes, yes. And I am excited to see collaborations grow. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I'm hoping that in the future there'll be more collaborations to be had, because it is just so important. And, I think sometimes it can take a bridge type of person to say, hey, I met this person from a different community. Let me introduce them to my community, whether that's writing or speaking or, just joining a group, whatever it is. And so I would challenge anybody who is watching today who maybe does have some connections in other communities. Think about ways that you can elevate their voice within your own community in ways that feel respectful and that they're open and consenting to, of course. But, each and every person has different connections. And if we can leverage our connections and like cross pollinate and all of this, it really is going to be helpful. And I feel like the powers that be, and abuse is always about power and control, they don't want us to unite. They want us to stay in our different categories, whether that's race or religion or sexual orientation or gender or any of those things. And when we are separated, we aren't as powerful. But when we can come together, like, we can change the world. And yes, there'll be differences, but there are so many things that we can unite upon. And one of those is ending abuse. Like, we can all get behind that.
Yes,
and if you can't,
100%.
listening to this episode,
Even like, why did I join SNAP? Like, what is an Orthodox Jewish woman doing on the board of SNAP? It sounds a little weird, right? When people say, so what board is that? Survivors Network for those abused by priests? What? Right? So why did I join it? Because I saw that while my community, the Jewish community, was doing a lot of good work, it was very organizational focused, right? How do we help organizations do better? How do we help them respond better? But I didn't see a place, and now there are more, however, but at the time, I didn't see a place where in the Jewish community there was we're going to work directly with survivors, for survivors, by survivors. So that's why I'm at SNAP, because this is the outlet where I can do that. I've had SNAP folk come to some of the places where I work, right? I've been invited to some of the SNAP folks places, like at this, sharing this platform with you. And so it's just about doing that, right? And as long as we respect our differences, there's so much that we can garner from our similarities. And like you said, like, we got to come together to end abuse.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, where can people find out more about you and your work? Tell us about your social media, tell us about your website, all the things.
Okay, so I'm on Twitter. I'm at Guila Ben, so my first name, Guila, and then the 3 letters of my last name, Ben. So I'm there. I was really busy tweeting a lot, but then like work and life got busy, so I quieted down a little bit. But I will be continuing to post there. I do post when I publish articles. You can also just look me up, and you'll find a lot of the articles I've written about abuse in Jewish spaces, as well about abuse in general. There's some articles about silence that we talked about today, and about the efforts to neutralize victims so that they don't have a voice, and what we need to do to combat that. And then lastly, if you go to the srenetwork.org, if you go to that place, you will find a report that I co-authored on the experiences of Jewish victims and survivors, as well as how the discourse on survivorship and equity is talked about in Jewish media. So that might be something interesting, as well as many resources from others on the SRE network, such as a recent guide around accountability when your community wants to take accountability. So those are just some places. And anybody can reach out. They can find me and reach out. It's a pleasure to be speaking to you, and it's an honor to be heard. So thank you so much, Ashley.
Thank you so much. The pleasure's all mine. I really enjoyed this conversation. I know our audience did too. And everybody who is listening, make sure you go ahead and hit share on this episode because you know that there's somebody in your friends list that is going to need this information, that they're going to gain something from this conversation. So go ahead and hit that share button, and definitely follow Guila everywhere that she is on her website, on Twitter, all the places. And then follow Courage 365 on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. And of course, you can catch the back episodes of the Courage Conversation Show on our website, courage365.org/videos. And just for coming to our website, you can download this free ebook, 5 Keys to Living a Life of Courage, to help you take your next most courageous steps. Now, this is going to be our last episode of the season. So this is the end of season 2 of the Courage Conversation Show. But never fear, in just about 2 weeks, the 1st of October, we're going to be bringing the 30 Days of Courage back. We had 700 people who joined us for the 30 Days of Courage online inside of the Courage 365 Facebook group last year, and we have some powerful speakers lined up for you again this year. You're not going to want to miss that. Make sure you're following us on social media so you can get all the details. Those will be coming out very, very soon. And one more thing I wanted to mention to you is we have created a special resource for you. This is our morning text chain. And we send a message written by survivors for survivors every morning. It's an inspirational text message, and all you have to do to get on that list is text the word courage to 917-809-7311. That's 917-809-7311. And when you text courage to that number, you'll be set up on our list, and you'll get an empowering message every morning from Courage 365. Again, stay tuned for details on the 30 Days of Courage, which are coming up. And yeah, thank you so much for tuning in. Live with courage.